Shit. I thought we had reached good dry land. We're going to have to go back to our kayaks. The gigantic burly man said to me, as if not having to carry the 100+ pounds of gear on our backs was going to be an inconvenience. We were about 2 hours from our launch site. We had managed to make it over an earthen ridge, which was bizarre in the Everglades, only to find the amount of earth to be brief. The water shouldn't be that deep around land, but it's murky and you don't want to break your ankles, he said, slinging the small boat off his back. I followed his lead as he gently placed his backpack on the tiny boat. It was 5:30 in the morning, and although I was already exhausted, I was stunned at the beauty of the sunrise as the ribbons of orange, blue and purple crept through the strange turquoise and red bromeliads and thick expanses of mangrove that struggled to hold the land down in one place. It was my first time kayaking in the Everglades. After my divorce, I decided to take up some new hobbies. My ex took my son when she left me for a doctor she was working with, leaving me with a whole fuck ton of free time. It was either drinking or focus on something else, and I didn't want my son to think I was a bum. I bought some snorkeling gear and cheap kayak so that I could join Mike, my last remaining buddy from college, during some of his adventures. He had also been through a divorce, but had assaulted his wife and her new beau after finding out they were going behind his back. He had just gotten out of his 6-month stint, and I figured it would help both of us. He had let his anger get to him and was more obsessed with being cheated on than he was concerned with the well-being of his own daughter. Despite his problems, I felt like he was the last friend I could hold on to. I was born and raised in Lake Worth, Florida, but I'd never explored its intracoastal or the Everglades. So this area up here changes, like constantly. Sometimes you have almost solid land, sometimes you have waist deep water. Not too many ridges though. Let's put our kayaks down there, Mike said patiently. I secured my gear and followed him out to the water again, testing it after a moment to see the depth. Sure enough, my 10-foot paddle couldn't hit the bottom. How do you tell the difference between deep and shallow water? I asked, staring at the water. I couldn't even see an inch below the surface, thanks to the incredible amount of aquatic vegetation. It was like looking at an underwater forest. You don't, Ted. I learned that the hard way, Mike said, laughing playfully as he paddled forward. Even after 3 months, it was hard not to think of my kid Kyle and how much he might enjoy the experience. I was thinking about how much he enjoyed exploring the parks my ex Ashley and I used to bring him to, when Mike suddenly came to a hard stop as he paddled over the water. What the fuck is this? He asked in confusion. Seeing as he was the more experienced, I was instantly worried. My kayak is caught. I think I'm over a rock or something. He used his paddles to try and turn around, but couldn't, and gave me a bump from my left. I think it's a rock or something. He tested the depth around whatever caught him, and his paddle had no difficulty hitting the bottom, indicating that it must have been one huge rock. Alright, give me a second, I said, going to his side to help try and push him off, when suddenly I felt the side of my own kayak scrape something hard. Shit! Whatever it is, there is another one over here. South Florida doesn't have a lot of naturally unsmooth surfaces in general, but in the Everglades, it was kind of strange to run into features that hadn't been ground down by Mother Nature. I managed to avoid the rock and help Mike get free, wondering what could have caused it in the ridge to begin with. "Wanna put on a snorkel and see what it is?" Mike asked. I didn't know how he planned on seeing anything in water that was absolutely choked with vegetation. But I was also pretty curious as to what was sticking out of the water like that. "Yeah, I guess we kinda have to, right?" I heard myself say reluctantly, the sudden memory of the existence of alligators and the like slowly coming back to me. Mike put on his absurdly long snorkeling goggles, and I followed suit. He found a spot that had enough length underneath it to hold our kayaks, and jumped in first. I took a few moments to psych myself up before going in after him, The world under the water was a stunning forest, the light managing to penetrate the thick canopy in incredible vibrant shafts. The vegetation didn't go very far below the surface, allowing us to swim easily. I made my way over to Mike and followed him to the spot. But what we saw had caught him long before we got there. It was a crude statue of an alligator standing up on two legs, carrying a staff. The small area we had paddled into seemed to have several other similar statues, forming a tight circle in the water with only a single entrance that we must have accidentally passed through. Mike just swam in place, staring at it for a moment before motioning for me to follow him to the surface. "What the fuck?" he asked me, as if I would know who had placed it there. "Maybe it's a Native American thing," I suggested. "Not possible. The Seminole rarely bothered with areas this far south, and before them it was just Ies and Jaga. There are no records of them doing any kind of stonework. Maybe they're more recent," he asked, probably knowing that I wouldn't know the answer. But it didn't feel likely. The statue had a primordial look to it. We should get some pictures," he said, clearly shaken. As we dove below again, he moved to some of the other statues. They were easily 15 feet tall each, and it was hard to imagine how someone would drag something so large out to the middle of nowhere. They were all animals that were once common in Florida. The Florida panther, a manatee, key deer, a strange bear, and a sawtooth fish, and several others. Each of them was standing upright, with human-looking legs. Strange hieroglyphs adorned their sides, still barely visible. The quality of the statues was absolutely stunning. Their details precisely measured, despite their foreign-looking artistic style that at first looked crude. As I finished investigating and photographing the symbols on the deer, I noticed Mike circling the area in the center of the strange circle. As I approached him, I saw why. There was one last statue, clearly larger than the rest. It was of a woman. But as I got closer, I saw that there was something wrong. Instead of eyes, there were small crab-like creatures intricately carved out of the stone, and another emerging from her mouth. More of the crustaceans seemed to cover her arms and legs. Aside from that, her face seemed to indicate pure ecstasy. His eyes stared in horror at the thing. Mike motioned for me to look down. I couldn't see much through the water, but he took off his snorkel and began diving. When he got near the bottom, he turned his light on, revealing the floor of the area to be covered in strange multicolored crawling crustaceans. As they fled, they revealed a large stone table that sat at the base of the statue of the woman. Mike seemed to investigate it quickly, and then swim back to the surface as fast as he could. I followed him and removed my mask. "Holy shit, dude," he said, staring down at his hands. "What the fuck is this place?" I asked, staring around the clearing to see if there were any signs of people having dragged and dropped massive fucking statues. The pseudo-lake that contained the circle was hemmed in by trees and raised land that looked unbroken. "I don't know, but look at this fucking thing," Mike said, barely containing his excitement. I swam over to him, and my jaw dropped. It was a mask, carved out of some kind of pale blue stone, and it was truly beautiful. Mike gestured for me to look more closely, so I reached out to touch it, and it sent more than a shiver up my spine. It was like my entire body reacted to it. "I think maybe we should mark this place on a GPS. Maybe come back later after we've done some research," he said, dreamily, not taking his eyes off of the mask. "Yeah, we should make sure we're not disturbing something important," I muttered, trying to hint that maybe it wasn't a great idea to take the mask, in case it was an archaeological find. But I didn't argue the point. I wanted to take a closer look at that thing too. We paddled back to our trucks and packed up. Mike didn't even bother cleaning off his kayak, and he was normally a stickler for following procedures like that. We headed back to his place, where we used Google to do some research on statues in the Everglades. Modern artists leaving statues in the water, tribes in the area, weird crab lady religions, and anything else we could think of. The only historical reference to anyone ever living in the area we could find was of the Spanish sending in a small military contingent to slaughter an entire tribe of restless natives that seemed like they probably lived in the general area. But that was barely a footnote and didn't mention any statues. I stayed at his place, going over everything over and over again until it was at least 9 at night. I think I'm going to email these pictures to some local professors. Maybe the Seminole tribe too, I said, thinking it was the logical next step. I was thinking the same thing, but we shouldn't be specific on where we found it, in case they want to steal our find. How about I try to find out what kind of stone this mask is? I know a guy who knows his way around this stuff at work. I agreed, but was reluctant to leave until Mike flat out told me he wanted to sleep. I went home, only to realize the moment I was in the truck that I was starving, having not eaten the entire day. I stopped at Curry Tabanka to pick up some curried duck doubles, kind of like a flatbread sandwich with curried chickpeas, a Trinidadian favorite. I only realized as I was eating that every muscle in my body was screaming out in pain from the relatively large amount of hiking and kayaking I had done that morning. I went to sleep the moment my head touched the pillow, but instantly found myself back in the small clearing. This time, however, there was no water, and the statues loomed over me with brightly painted faces. It was nighttime, but fires lit around the circle allowed me to see a group of people wearing grass skirts staring at me. I knew it was a dream, but that didn't stop it from feeling real. A tall, beautiful woman amidst them beckoned for me to join them, smiling gently. I woke before I reached him. The next week, I went to work and tried to focus, but couldn't. I wasn't bothered by my lingering divorce anymore though. In fact, I ignored several calls from Ashley, only checking my messages to make sure that they weren't emergencies. She wanted to know if I could help her and her new husband move. An appalling thought. Ignoring her allowed me the freedom to spend most of the week Googling Native American statues and carvings to see if I could find anything like what I had seen. I couldn't get the mask out of my head. The intricate carvings seemed to have a slightly wry smirk and haunting beautiful eyes. I didn't remember any more of my dreams, but I woke up from one with the impression that I had seen Kyle in one of them. I had to see it again, and it pushed Kyle out of my head. I bided my time and ignored Ashley's pleas for help, even ignoring an attempt to see Kyle on the weekend. I knew I was going to be busy with Mike. On Friday, I called him to see if he was open to hang on Saturday, but really just to see what he had found out about the mask.
Nothing. No one seems to know anything at all. One professor told me he thought I was making it up because none of the tribes made stone carvings, and it was illegal to dispose of made things in the Everglades. Threatened to call the popo.
Mike laughed. Do you want to go back out? See if we can find something new out there? I asked, hoping he would say yes. He paused for a long moment.
Absolutely,
he said. We made plans to meet on Saturday morning, long before the sun came out. After the call was finished, another call came up, and I recognized the number. John Gaffin, the man my ex had cheated on me with. How he could have the balls to speak to me was beyond me. My blood boiled, especially when I heard the message, where he asked if we could get a beer and said he didn't want to be my enemy. Well, maybe he shouldn't have fucked my wife then. My anger bled away quickly though, turning my mind back to focus on that mask. I looked through my phones at pictures of it, marveling at it through the images and wishing I had taken more. When I woke on Saturday, I had a brief but distinct memory of being in the clearing again. I was thrilled, but Mike was almost half an hour late to meeting me at our lunch site. He looked and smelled like shit, He had clearly lost a good bit of weight during the week, not like the amount that you lose on a diet. His clothes hung off of him loosely. His face looked different too. Not just less fat, but strangely angular. "Sorry I'm late. I overslept," he muttered as he took his kayak out of his truck. Water spilled from it, which surprised me. Either he had been kayaking again during the week, or he hadn't cleaned it or taken it out of his truck the entire time. "So, did you bring the mask again? I was hoping to take another look at it, really quick," I asked, hoping to sound innocuous even though I didn't plan on doing anything with it. "What? Oh, no, sorry. Maybe we could look at it at my place or something," he said, dismissively as he put his kayak in the water, filling me to the brim with disappointment. I tried to hide my disappointment and just said, "Cool," as I followed him. But it consumed me. I had spent the entire week wanting that thing, desiring it, and a part of me thought that he knew that he must have understood how I felt about it. I felt deeply spurned, somehow even more than I did when I found out that John Gaffin didn't give a shit about the things I loved. For a moment, I couldn't help comparing my failed marriage to the mask. But I pushed the thought out of my head as we reached the strange clearing. Mike dove into the water without even putting his snorkel on. I paddled up to his kayak and was about to do the same when I noticed a small brown waterproof sack I hadn't seen him use before. I opened it up out of curiosity, and there it was. He had brought the mask with him. The deception hit me like a hammer. How could I trust him now with the thing that I suddenly desired the most after he lied to me about what he was doing with it? I put it back and put my snorkel on, not wanting to alert him to my suspicion. I dove in just as he came up to gasp for air, but he didn't say a thing before going back down. I meandered about the statues as he went back and forth between the table and the surface. He left some lights down at the bottom, and they revealed him to be frantically searching the table underneath and around it, as well as the statue of the woman. The strange crabs didn't seem to mind, and actually began crawling back to the area. I felt as drawn to the woman as he must have, and went to investigate her. Aside from the bizarre arthropods covering her, she was beautiful. The statue was so stunningly well preserved, with barely any wear and tear. The symbols could still be visible, although some were less preserved than others. I ran my fingers along her arm and felt chill run up my spine as it had when I touched the mask. I knew, somehow, that it was the woman from the dream. I stared in shock at her face, and the crabs. They were the same as the ones at the bottom of the pool. Somehow, I just knew it. I took off my snorkel and dove down to confirm my suspicion. Sure enough, they looked the same. Multiple sets of pincers and horrible claw-like appendages surrounded their mouths. The crabs turned to face me as I approached them, almost attentively. I looked over and saw Mike shaking his head in frustration and swimming back to the surface again, so I followed him. "Find anything?" I asked, hoping he didn't notice his bag had been opened. He shook his head and gasped for air repeatedly. He had taken quite a few dives with only a quick gasp in between them. "Something missing. There's something missing. There's supposed to be something there," he said, desperately, before going back down for another dive. I didn't ask him how he knew something else was supposed to be there. I could feel it to a much lesser degree. Something was supposed to be there, needed to be there. Something was missing, and it felt powerfully, inherently wrong. Eventually, Mike gave up and looked extremely upset about it. It was bothering me too, and we remained utterly silent on the way home. I asked him if he wanted to do it again next week, and he grunted and nodded consent. But that was it. I didn't bother to ask him about going back to his place. When I got home, I checked my phone and realized I had a missed call from Ashley. But when I checked the messages, it was Kyle who wanted to speak with me. I remembered that I hadn't spoken to him since the first trip to the Everglades. That gave me pause. I thought for a moment that it was the first time that ever happened in his life. But remembered, it wasn't. I had forgotten to talk to him when Ashley and I first split up too. As much as I wanted to go see the mask again, this thought somehow managed to weigh more. I called back and apologized, telling them I had been given extra hours at work. Hearing him talk brought a spark of joy back to me. It made me realize that focusing on the mystery of the mask, as well as hating Ashley and her new beau, had something in common. They weren't making me happy. Kyle made me happy. I wondered what the fuck the mask had done. I didn't believe in spirits or anything like that, but something was horribly wrong with Mike. I told myself he must have finally gone nuts and tried my best to ignore the memories of how I too had felt. When I went to sleep that night, I was in the clearing again. Just like before, the statues loomed over us instead of being submerged. This time, I was standing directly in front of the natives, their faces and bodies painted bone white, aside from the woman. She gestured to the stone table and then to me. Sadly, something was missing. She gracefully touched my arms, and the memories of my life flooded through me uncontrollably. I felt strangely ashamed, as if I had been caught being unfaithful, as if I had been expected to give something, to do something. She said a word to me that I couldn't recall when I woke up. As I showered, I decided not to go out to the Everglades with Mike again. Something was more than just wrong, and it was probably best that I stay the fuck away from it. It occurred to me that he never told me what kind of stone the mask had been made of. And I did some research. The names of the professors he told me he emailed didn't bring anything up. I was willing to bet that he never emailed anyone, never showed the mask to his buddy at work. Somehow, I guessed that he probably hadn't even been to work, despite it being the kind of thing that would piss off his parole officer. Sunday rolled by, and another call from John came through. I ignored it. Of course I wanted more time with my son, but I hated that man with every fiber of my being. He called a couple more times, but didn't leave a message. Work that week was less stressful than normal, and by Wednesday, I was still struggling to forget the mask, trying to turn back to being concerned for my work and Kyle's well-being. It wasn't easy, and I found myself looking at the photos every time I went to my phone. On Wednesday evening, John called again, and I ignored it. This time, however, he called over and over again, not leaving a message. On the 15th time, I finally picked up.
You son of a bitch. You have no right to take Kyle.
And John screamed into the phone. What the fuck are you talking about?
Like you don't fucking know. Should I just call the cops now, or are you going to bring him back? Your psychopath friend heard Ashley, you piece of shit.
The realization snapped in my head like a whip. Mike had taken him. Mike had taken Kyle. Because the mask wanted Kyle. It wanted me first, but when it couldn't have me, it decided it wanted him. He was the part that was missing. Suddenly, full-blown panic exploded in my head. Mike was going to take Kyle to that fucking table, and then I had no idea what was going to happen to him. But I knew I would never see him again. I didn't take Kyle, and Mike is. He went crazy. You have to believe me. We need to get Kyle back quickly. We don't have much time. John seemed taken aback by this, and more frightened than I thought he would be.
Okay, I understand. For the moment, I'm willing to believe you. Ashley said he looked off, so we need to call the cops. They'll handle.
I cut him off. When did this happen? I demanded.
I started calling you the moment Ashley told me. Maybe 20 minutes. He was right outside our apartment.
I cursed myself for not picking up the phone when he called. Picking up the phone could have made the difference between my son being safe or not. It had been almost 20 minutes. "We don't have enough time, we just don't. It might already be too late," I screamed, realizing that whatever was behind that mask, whatever force had worked through the situation, was going to take my son away forever. As I got into my truck and started barreling down the road, I told John about the clearing and that Mike was obsessed with it. He asked me where the nearest launch site was, and we agreed to meet there. I didn't think it was remotely possible to paddle fast enough to keep up with Mike, but I had to try. We got there in record time, and despite the situation, it was still awkward as fuck. I tried to push away all the anger I had towards the man out of my head as he stepped out of his Lexus SUV and nodded to me. I almost mentioned something about it, but he pointed to the rear of his vehicle, and I realized that he had a trailer attached to it. And on that trailer were 2 jet skis. "Thank God," I shouted when I saw them. He didn't say anything, and we unloaded them into the water. Despite having to go a longer way to avoid the areas Mike and I had hiked over land or through shallows, we started nearing the clearing in the tensest hours I had ever felt. Still, hopefully faster than Mike. From the distance, a faint glow illuminated the area surrounding the clearing, and the light made it clear that the clearing didn't just have a ridge. It had a massive circle of raised earth rising from the water. The circle broken only by the route Mike and I had taken into it. Otherwise, it was like an earthen fort I had seen in pictures of archaeological digs. As we pulled to the exterior of the area marked on my GPS, I saw it. Fires lit around the circle. John slammed his jet ski directly into that, shattering its nose as he leapt from the vehicle. As we climbed through the mangroves, I gasped in astonishment. The water was gone, drained from the clearing and turning it into a pit where the statues loomed, blocking the view of the interior. Mike's kayak was there, next to a shovel and some industrial equipment and a tent. This was where Mike had been living. That thing had consumed him. The interior of what was now a pit was lined with an earthen stairway. "Mike, where the fuck are you?" I screamed at the top of my lungs as I raced down the earth pathway to the bottom of the pit, with John right behind me. When we got there, we both stopped for a moment and stared at the scene in front of us. The crabs were still there, facing the table attentively, their claws raised to the air. Mike was there behind the table, in front of Kyle, who was hog-tied on the stone table. Except, Mike wasn't Mike anymore. His obsession had consumed him utterly. He was rail thin, but his arms and legs were strangely long, pale and shiny, his face concealed behind the mask. But I saw it move strangely as he hissed at us, and realized that anthropod-looking pincers were holding the mask in place. I rushed forward to grab Kyle, but I knew I was going to be too late. Mike raised a terrible-looking knife made from sharpened stone over my son with both arms, preparing to bring it down. When suddenly, I heard an incredible bang, followed only by ringing in both of my ears. Mike staggered back for a moment as I rushed forward. But another 2 bangs rang out, cutting straight through the ringing. I felt the crabs pulling angrily at my legs, their pincers cutting into my flesh. I grabbed Kyle off the table while Mike fell backwards, the knife flying from his hands. As I turned to get out of there, I saw John pointing a revolver at Mike, smoke flowing freely from the barrel. He fired it 2 more times as I ran up the stairway. And when I looked down, I saw that one of the shots had connected to Mike's face and blown the mask and his skull apart. Instead of a skull, however, there were horrible folds of chitinous material and 2 pincers still scrambling desperately in the dark, even as the crabs rushed greedily over his body. We untied Kyle and made sure he was alright. Then, we all climbed onto the one good jet ski we had left and started back home. I hugged him for what must have been an hour before he finally went back to his mother in John's SUV. I still hated that, but it was a lot easier to push it aside. Since then, Johnny and I had enjoyed a few beers. I came to realize that the divorce wasn't entirely Ashley's fault. I had my own problems, and we just weren't working out. It still hurt that she cheated on me. But it is what it is. No one ever found Mike's body, although his parole officer did call me once. Apparently, he had left his GPS unit at home. So I told him he must have gotten lost in the Everglades and acted sad. I did eventually touch base with some professors, but apparently the natives in the area, the IEs and Jaga, were relatively normal, straightforward people who mainly just enjoyed fishing and wanted to be left alone. Whoever used to live in that earthen mound seemed to have little to do with anyone. And it was apparently likely that the other natives avoided the area. Most importantly, since then, I have never let my anger towards Ashley get in the way of my relationship with Kyle, and have never missed a phone call since.